If you do ultimately lose another MP and the Liberals form a majority, will you stay on as leader?
That'll be up to the members of our party, because our party is not run by backroom deals in Ottawa.
But you'll be at that convention no matter what?
Yes.
Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre says the future of his leadership will be in the party membership's hands come January. Our Sunday strategy session is here to talk about that, the year that was, and what could happen next year. Kathleen Monk is a former NDP strategist and director of communications to the late Jack Layton. Kory Teneycke was Ontario Premier Doug Ford's campaign manager and former director of communications for Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And Scott Reid is a former communications director to Prime Minister Paul Martin. Hi, everybody. It's very nice to see you today on this last edition of our Strats for the year. Kory, I'll start with you. I think there have been lots of questions over the past few weeks around Mr. Poilievre's leadership because of these floor crossers. How do you think the party membership is going to reconcile the idea that it is what he's focused on in his leadership that brought the party to these new heights, but at the same time appears to be a liability in other areas?
Well, the membership and people who voted for the party and then the people who are going to vote at the convention, those are all three different groups of people. So I don't think the most recent floor crossing will really factor in a ton into the leadership vote, in that the delegates have already been selected, prior to that happening. So that voting pool is already set. And it usually biases itself towards the incumbent leaders. So I don't foresee any problem for Poilievre at the vote at the convention, but that doesn't mean that he's out of the woods with respect to caucus. If we look back in history as to how leaders tend to get deposed over time, and I guess John Rustad would be a good recent example of that. You can win a leadership vote and then have questions around your leadership persist. And I think if you're Poilievre and his team, you've got to be hoping that that won't be the case here, and that you can stop these floor crossings from continuing to happen, and lay down an attack narrative around the government that gets some traction.
The government and some ministers in particular, Scott, have been pretty interestingly open about the idea that there are potential other floor crossers. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, they might be making mischief, or they might know something we don't. They certainly have been teasing that possibility. And I really take my lead from how Pierre Poilievre responded to that question when you interviewed him. And I thought it was fascinating. I mean, you want to talk about defensive. If he'd shown up with a hockey helmet and goalie pads, he couldn't have looked more defensive in that interview. And the reason is that he's inherently working from a defensive posture. When you asked him that question, will there be more defections? Might you even lose the parliamentary majority to caucus defections? He couldn't dismiss the possibility. All he could do was denigrate that possibility. And I thought that was very, very telling, because he doesn't know. So if the ministers think they know something we don't, Pierre Poilievre also doesn't know. And it leaves him in a really weak position. Now, his messaging on it's a bad idea to secure a majority through parliamentary defections, he might find some traction in the public with that. And Kory and I have talked about that before. We don't agree, but I think there could be some traction as people go, that sounds wrong to me. But nevertheless, it leaves Poilievre as the mayor of Losertown. I mean, he's literally talking on air about the possibility of losing the majority after, as you pointed out in your interview, he lost an election he was supposed to win. He lost his seat, which is supposed to be a lock, and now he's losing members of his own caucus. And so this is not a confident, forward-looking leader at this point. He is, by definition, in a defensive posture, talking about why it would be terrible if more terrible things happen to him. This guy needs to get some W's in 2026, starting with that leadership review, because it's all bad right now.
I do think, though, you can also interpret from the fact that he is taking questions, and in particular from the mainstream on this, that he is still fighting. Like he does still want to fight to lead the party.
For sure. And these next 6 weeks are going to be crucial, where he lays out a plan of where he's going to take the party going forward. Because the problem with the Conservatives is they have really great polling numbers, but it masks the larger structural problem about Pierre Poilievre's actual viability. Last year at this time we were talking about Trudeau, and people were frustrated. There was flags out in the street, right? And people had fatigue with Trudeau and wanted him to go. But there weren't the floor crossers, right? There were members of his cabinet who decided to resign, who decided to leave, but there weren't people who were actively jumping from one party to another. And that's the problem that Pierre right now is dealing with.
Even when they're at 40 points in the polls, as you point out.
Their polling numbers are great, but it really does mask the challenge that it's not just about motivating your base and having committed voters say that they like the leader. His negatives are high, and he needs to actually think of a campaign to actually broaden the base. And I really do think it's a question of viability. Is he viable as a leader for the Conservative Party if they want to form government? Have Canadians, Canadians said they saw Trudeau, they didn't like him, they had enough of him. But now the question is, they know Pierre Poilievre, and will they ever actually vote for him for Prime Minister?
Kathleen brings us down, Kory, memory lane a year ago when Justin Trudeau was still Prime Minister for a few more weeks. When you look back on this year, what defines it politically for you?
Well, I think probably the biggest story of the year is, you can frame it one of two ways: the Liberal resurgence or the collapse of what looked like an absolute certainty for the Conservatives in the election campaign. And I think that's the biggest story. It's probably, if we look back historically, the biggest reversal of fortunes in Canadian political history. And you don't see that very often. That's the biggest. I think that's the biggest story. And to Kathleen's point, what we're seeing now is not a polling problem for the Conservatives. It's a polling problem for Poilievre. Yeah. And the party is quite popular by historical standards. On most of the issues that are actually driving those polling numbers, the Conservatives have a substantial issue advantage. And I think they'd be very high in the polls if not for Poilievre's very weak leadership numbers. And this is what's driving the floor crossing, and ultimately I think is what will determine his fate. Either Poilievre figures out how to soften his image and bring those personal numbers up, or he's going to have a really difficult year.
What defines this year of politics for you, Scott?
Well, it is hard to lay off what is, as Kory mentioned, a truly historic reversal of fortunes. Mark Carney comes out of nowhere, never held elected office, takes over the leadership in a walk, which wasn't expected to be a walk, and then wins government against an opponent who was supposed to crush everybody. So that's one hell of a story. But to me, the big story and one of the underlying causes of all of that phenomenon, Donald Trump and tariff policy toward Canada. I mean, he has literally declared Canada an enemy, and he's moved aggressively to try to undermine not just free trade, but some of the tenets of our economy. And so we've seen that drive our politics in 2025, that drove that federal election. One of the dynamics that created so many doubts about Mr. Poilievre and his leadership was whether he was up to that moment. And by wide enough margin to hand Mark Carney a near majority, Canadians concluded that he was not up to it. And again, it's Trump that looms in the background. And sneak peek, Trump is still there for us.
Well, yeah, it's going to get really calm next year with Cosmo Review, right?
Yeah.
Right. Last word to you, Kathleen. What defined the year politically?
Yeah, so obviously Scott and Kory are right in terms of what the big stories are. So I'll try to turn to tell viewers about a couple other stories that I think are really important. I think number one, I think last year we were sitting here and we're thinking about who could potential Liberal leaders be. And I think a lot of people said at the time that Mark Carney was too new to politics, wouldn't be able to survive. And that often when we parachuted kind of people in from the private sector quickly or academia, in the case of Michael Ignatieff, into politics, they don't always survive. Well, so far it looks like he's kind of survived. And I would also add one, story that was really obviously important to me. 10 years ago, New Democrats had over 100 seats. In this last election in April, they went down to 7. Haven't been that low or even near that low in over 3 decades. So that's a story, and it has actually created almost a polarization of politics in Canada, and whether that remains in terms of two parties or whether it continues to diversify, as I think Canadians truly want, a multi-party system, is kind of the question that I'm looking at for 2026.
Well, that leads us right into our next segment. After a short commercial break, we're going to ask each of our panelists what the biggest challenge their political party will face next year. We're back with that conversation and our strats in a moment.